Welcome back. Today we're talking about section 1.4, which is all about absolute value and adding real numbers. The main topic in this section is that we want to look at how do we add numbers when we start talking about negative numbers. So negative numbers and positive numbers together can sometimes get confusing. So we want to review what do we do to add real numbers when we have those negative and positives coming together. Before we do that, we do want to review just what a negative number is and what absolute value is, because we're going to use the concept of absolute value to add these real numbers together. Okay, so let's start off by just doing a quick review of exactly what the negative of a number is. And the negative of a number is also called the opposite of that number. So just realize that if you see that as well, that it means the same thing. So the negative or opposite of a number. What exactly is that? So it's easiest to think about this on a number line, right? We've worked with those negative numbers when we were plotting numbers or graphing numbers on a number line. So if we have a number line here, what happens is that these two numbers are going to be on the opposite sides of 0. So if I have some number, let's call it A over here, then the opposite of that number is going to be the same distance from 0, but to the left of 0 rather than to the right of 0. And negatives of numbers are opposites because they just go back and forth. So the opposite of a positive A is negative A, and the opposite of a negative A is a positive A, which means that if I see negative, so I want the opposite of a negative, those two things cancel out and it becomes a positive A. So that's a little note we want to make to ourselves. There is that two negatives, so we can simplify negatives down. If I see two negatives together, two negatives cancel each other. So I can simplify negatives now, and if I see negative of a negative number, that just turns back into the positive number. We just cycle back between the negative and positive version of that number. We can get to a more simplified form. Okay, so first let's just look at a couple examples when we have a few negatives going on at the same time. So can you simplify these negative numbers down? Oops, forgot the P in simplify. Let's try that again. All right, can you simplify negative 3? What would we actually want to call that? Hopefully there you got positive 3. So the opposite of a negative 3 is a positive 3. Now what if you have a few more negatives going on? So what if we have negative 4? Okay, so always just pair your negatives together when you see a bunch of them. So what happens here is two negatives cancel each other and we're left with just one negative there. So that ends up being negative 4. Okay, so just always remember two negatives come together to turn back into a positive. All right. Now, the second thing we want to review before going into adding real numbers is what the absolute value of a number is. So when we're looking at adding real numbers, it's helpful to look at the absolute values of those numbers first. And that just means the distance from 0. So the absolute value of a number is its distance from 0. So go back up to your number line here real quick and notice that when I have two numbers, a positive and a negative, they are the same distance from 0. So this is a distance of A, and this is a distance of A. If I just think about how far it is away from 0. So what happens is, when I think about the absolute value, it doesn't really do anything to a positive number. The absolute value of a positive number is A. But what happens is if I take the absolute value of a negative number, I'm just thinking about that distance, and distances are not negative. So essentially also what an absolute value does is it says just think about the number, don't think about the sign for a second. Okay, so let's just make sure we've got that. with a few examples here of just calculating some absolute values to make sure we understand what those are calculating. So what is the absolute value then of 2? Just 2. It's 2 units from 0. What's the absolute value of -2? That is just a positive 2, right? -2 is 2 units away from 0. Now you have to just be careful here. If the negative is on the outside of the absolute value signs, here the only thing that goes away is the negative on the inside of the absolute value signs. So -2 is a distance of 2 from 0. Well, we want the opposite of that number, so this negative on the outside stays. And the final answer to that would be -2. So just to get a good idea of how absolute values work. But knowing that the absolute value is the distance from 0. It's looking at the number without the sign. So we're going to use that idea of looking at a number without the sign to come up with some steps for adding real numbers. And we're going to break up adding real numbers into a couple of different scenarios. The first scenario is going to be adding two real numbers. First, we're going to look at with them being the same sign. With the same sign. Okay, first topic. So when you think about adding two numbers with the same sign, I'm going to give you just a couple of simple steps here to kind of go back to and follow in order to do this. So the key here is, again, to be able to understand how to do this without having to plug it into your calculator. So the first thing you're going to do is just think about those two numbers without the sign. So add the absolute values of the numbers, which is the easy thing to do because absolute values are always positive. So that means we're just going to add two positive numbers. But if the numbers are both negative, then we're going to give the sign, the sum, that same sign. So always give the sum the sign of the two numbers. So if you add two positive numbers, you're going to get a positive answer, a positive sum. But if you add two negative numbers, your final sum should be negative. And that's it. Okay, so let's look at, again, some examples. The easiest thing to do, right, is to add two positive numbers together. The absolute value of a positive number is a positive number. So here I just think, okay, 3 plus 5. I don't even really have to think through those steps, right? We know how to do two positive numbers. That's just 8. But the more confusing thing tends to be when we have both negative numbers. So what do I do when it's -3 plus -5? So we're in that same sign. I have two negative numbers being added together. And I just think, okay, if they're both the same sign, I can just over here, I'm thinking, all right, just add the absolute values. So just add 3 plus 5, which is 8. But my final answer over here isn't going to be 8 because it doesn't make sense to add two negative numbers and get a positive number. Think about your number line here as well as we're really thinking through what's going on. Essentially, we're starting off over here at -3, and we want to take 5 away. So we're going to move 5 then again in this direction. So this final sum needs to be negative because I'm adding two negative numbers together. All right, so always double check the sign in the end. And we can do this with fractions as well. Okay, so how would you add -1/2 plus -5/12? Well, the first thing I see is they're the same sign. So again, over here, I'm thinking, okay, let's simplify this down for a second. I know my final answer, though, should be negative because I'm adding two negative numbers together. But the number that I'll get in the end is whatever I get when I take the absolute values and add them together. So I want to take 1/2 plus 5/12. Pause, see if you can do 1/2 plus 5/12. you should have taken 1/2 times 6 over 6 to get a common denominator. That gives you, whoops, that gives you 6/12 plus 5/12, which ends you up with 11/12. But we want to make sure it's negative in the end, so our final answer is negative 11/12 because I added two negative numbers together, so my final answer should be negative. Okay, so those rules are a little bit more straightforward. The harder case tends to be the next case, where we want to add, when we're adding two numbers, this time with different signs. Okay, this is the harder case because there isn't a straightforward rule about what the sign will always be. Before it was, if it's two positives, the answer is positive. If it's two negatives, the answer is negative. But this will go back and forth depending on the scenario. So what we're looking at here is what happens when we add a positive with a negative number. Well, the first step is going to be very similar when you're thinking about, okay, what are some easy, maybe steps I can follow to make sure I understand what's going on. So again, you're going to think about using the absolute values. So drop the signs for a second. So if you have a positive and a negative number you're trying to add together, just think about the absolute values, think about the positive versions of the number, both numbers first. So use the absolute value of each number. And once you have just the positive versions, always take the larger minus the smaller. Okay, so we're looking at two positive numbers now, and whatever's bigger, we're going to take away the smaller number. So this answer in number 2 is always going to be positive. But the third step then is to do that double check for the sign. So what should the sign be? So your final step is to check the sign. Should it remain positive, or does the final sign need to be negative? And the answer to that is that the sum always gets the sign of the larger number. So if that larger number was originally negative, your final answer needs to be negative. All right, so let's see how this works out. Let's look again at some examples. So here's an example. We've got a negative number plus a positive number. So what we do here is we think in absolute values. We think, okay, we're looking at 8 and 4 then. My two numbers are 8 and 4. The larger number is 8, so I need to take 8 minus 4. 8 minus 4 is 4. So I know my final answer over here is some version of 4, either positive or negative. The larger number was 8, and in the problem, that 8 was positive. So my final answer should be positive 4. So essentially, when you're adding numbers of opposite signs, you're always doing a subtraction problem, and your final answer gets the sign of the larger number. So what if you take 5 plus negative 12? Again, over here, what we're thinking is in terms of absolute values. Okay, so my numbers are 5 and 12 if I think about absolute values. The larger number is 12 and the smaller number is 5. So really I'm subtracting 12 minus 5 to get 7. So my final answer is positive or negative 7. My larger number was 12. In my original problem, that was a negative. So my final answer needs to be negative. Okay, same thing for fractions. Same thing applies. So what if we need to take negative 5/6 plus 1/6? I think in terms of the absolute values. That is 5/6 and 1/6. The bigger number here is 5/6. So I need to take 5/6 minus 1/6 to get 4/6. Always still simplify that answer. 4/6 will simplify to 2/3. So my final answer is a version of 2/3, but what was my larger number? My larger number was 5/6, which was negative in my original answer. So my final answer needs to be negative. It works with fractions the same way it works with whole numbers. All right. So that's what we do, and now we just want to look at some applications. When am I going to have to add numbers of different signs? So here are some applications to look at. We're just going to look at 2 different examples here. The first one is looking at some budgeting, okay? Or some transactions that could happen in real life. So let's say your credit card balance, whoops, just writing credit again. Your credit card balance is negative $342. So you owe $342 to your credit card. You pay $55 towards the balance. But then you spend $15 on school supplies. Can you figure out what is your final balance? Okay, so we have to think about what's going on here. So let's start from the beginning. We're starting at a balance of negative $342, and we pay $55 towards that balance. So let's stop there first and figure out what our balance is at that point. So if I pay $55 towards my balance, what should I do to negative 342? I'm going to add in $55 because I'm paying that towards my balance. I'm not taking away more money. I'm not putting myself into more debt. I'm taking myself out of debt because I'm paying towards that balance. Okay, so I need to take negative 342 plus 55. That's a negative number plus a positive number. So again, I think in terms of absolute values. My 2 numbers are 342 and 55. The bigger one is 342, so I need to subtract 55 away. Go ahead and do that subtraction problem. You're going to have to do some borrowing, right, if you're doing this by hand. So I'll borrow 1 from the 4. 12 minus 5 is 7. I'll borrow 1 from the 3. 13 minus 5 is 8. And 2 minus 0 is 2. So my final answer is a version of 287, but my bigger number was 342, which was negative. So this is my balance now is negative $287. So I owe less to the credit card company because I made a payment towards my bill. But then I spend $15 on school supplies. So then I take away again from that balance. Okay, so I have a balance of negative 287, and I need to now add in another negative $15 because I'm taking away some more money from my balance. I'm going to owe more money. When you owe money, that's a negative amount. So this time I need to add in a negative amount. So now I'm adding 2 numbers of the same sign. When they're the same sign, we just add the 2 numbers, and then it gets the sign of the both numbers. So the both of the numbers are negative. So my final sign will be negative. And then over here, I just need to do that addition. When they're the same sign, you add the numbers. When they're different signs, you subtract the numbers. So adding these numbers together, I end up with 302. So my final balance is negative $302. Okay, so got good practice there doing both scenarios. Final application I want to look at is looking at temperatures and change. Okay, so the temperatures can involve negative numbers. Okay, so at this particular time, the temperature at 6 a.m., whoa, that M got crazy. The temperature at 6 a.m. was negative 3 degrees Fahrenheit. What we know is that it has gone up by 15 degrees. And I want you to tell me what is the temperature now, after it's gone up by that 15 degrees. Okay, so what should we do here? We're currently at negative 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's gone up by 15. So we add in 15. I'm adding a negative number plus a positive number. So what do I think? I think, okay, I need to think about the absolute values. I've got the numbers 3 and 15. They're opposite signs, so I must subtract the larger minus the smaller. 15 minus 3 is 12. So my final answer here is 12, but is it positive or negative? 15 was positive in the original problem. That means my final answer should be positive, and make sure you put the unit on it because we're talking about in context. So the temperature now is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so a couple different applications there of adding some real numbers together. Again, very important here that you understand what's going on and not just putting this into your calculator. You will be able to use your calculator on an exam here, but I want to be able to see you think through that process and make sure you understand, you know what you're doing, you know why the calculator is giving you that positive 12 answer versus a negative 12 answer, and so on. All right, as always, email me if you have questions, and hopefully that helped out. Give that homework a try.